My name is Trina Crochet. I'm an assistant professor at Wentworth Institute of Technology here in Boston, and I teach within the interior design program. I've put together a slide presentation for you this morning so that you would become more familiar with the American Federal style. As usual with most of my seminars or lectures, I always like to set up a precedent. So I would like to take a few moments to review some of the American architectural styles first, through example, discuss some of the influences that we see in American architecture, and then focus more specifically on the American Federal style in the newly formed United States of America that began about 1785. And once again, if you don't have a program, again, just leave me your name and address and I'll make sure that I send you one. Okay, I wanted to start out with a few slides, again, just introducing you to some of the prevalent American architectural styles that are more focused in the New England area, but by all means we would make concessions that these styles were also prevalent in some of the southern states as well. I did try to focus it more to New England, but I have one admission to make, and that is I am a southerner. So this was very, very pleasurable for me to do a little bit more research about the New England area and find out more about the regional differences. Most of the slides that I'm going to show you today, as far as the architectural slides, come from my town in Hingham. And I'm not sure how many people are from this area. Show of hands? Okay, so I'm sure you probably know where Hingham is. For those of you who don't, it's on the South Shore. It's about 17 miles south of Boston. And I think it's a beautiful town in many ways, beautiful people, but also beautiful architecture. So for those of you who don't have the benefit of the program, I will point out also where these homes are located, just for your reference. But what is nice about Hingham is that it's a town that was established in 1635, and we have some very rare treasures that are still standing and are actually still people's homes. So what I want to do with the precedent is just, again, a quick review of where we have started from as far as, again, the American style, and then project again through a few centuries to end up with the American Federal style. So the first part will be very brief. I will go through the architectural styles through the Victorian period and then stop and then back up to the American Federal style. What I am showing you at this moment is an example of what we would consider to be American colonial architecture. And dates sometimes vary depending upon the publication. So the dates that I've chosen are fairly consistent from publication to publication. The dates for the American colonial period as far as an architectural style is listed again in textbooks beginning in 1670. We could probably say that the first shelter that was built in this new world would also be somewhat considerable of the American colonial style. What we do have to realize, however, is since this is a new settlement in the early 17th century, that most people were concerned with shelter, primarily as a means of shelter, and therefore we don't see the refinement in architectural styles or even interior furnishings until the country begins to settle, prosper, and grow. So hopefully also the slides will reflect this sense of establishment in the New World and then the prosperity that will follow towards the end of the 18th century. Also keep in mind, with a lot of the slides that I'm showing you this afternoon, is that since some of these structures are nearing 400 years old, there have been alterations. The first slide that I have on the screen is from 1680, and it's a slide of the Old Ordinary, which was a tavern. The structure has been added onto, and I had basically wanted to just focus on some of the characteristics that make it typical with the American colonial style. And what we tend to see, especially in New England, is the use of clapboard for the siding. This is something that will remain a very strong characteristic for American architecture, and primarily because it is affordable. It's something that's plentiful and it's more affordable. By the time we look at structures that are made out of brick, we again have to be aware that there is a lot more wealth that has been established in the New World for people who can afford the brick. In other instances, you do see a lot of brick also in the South. So some of this is also regional. But a few of the characteristics that we're going to see in the American colonial style is that the basic structure started out usually as one room, and from that one room we've expanded the footprint of the dwelling structure to add a second room and then ultimately 4 rooms. And what we will see throughout time is, again, the beginning stages of a first floor being expanded into second floor and even third floor dwellings. One of the primary characteristics of the American colonial style is that the fireplace is usually centrally located. And in most of the slides that I'm going to show you in this segment on American colonial, you'll see that as a design trait. One of the other things that we would want to pay attention to is the steeply pitching roof, because this is something that is going to change by the time we see a full-fledged federal style, again in 1785 and after. And the other thing that we will typically see with American colonial architecture is the fact that the windows are placed very tight under the eaves of the roof. And again, most of these characteristics you can see here in the Old Ordinary. As I had mentioned before, it was a tavern. As in most cases, a lot of the taverns were also the homes of the individuals who ran the tavern. And it is something that, again, in the town of Hingham, it's one of our oldest structures, among many from the 17th century. Okay, here we're looking at a residence, and once again, what we're focusing on for right now is American colonial. We're taking a look at the facade of this particular house that has been expanded upon over time. If you could try to ignore the extension off to the rear, then you can pretty much identify, again, these very strong characteristics. In this particular house, which is from 1687, the one thing that you might notice right away is the dormer windows in the roof, which is providing us extra room in the second level. What might be most striking about it, however, is the fact that the windows aren't really symmetrical in their placement. This is something that, again, is in the late 17th century. We're starting to see some established communities and we're starting to see the growth of towns, but we really aren't, again, caught up so much in some of the styles that are prevalent in England. We're not concentrating as far as this time on the formal symmetry of the facade and what type of impression it makes from the street side. One of the other things just to point out about this particular residence is, again, the fact that the windows are placed very tightly under the eaves. Now, this particular house, with the exception of the addition into the rear, is fairly authentic. Again, considering 1687, there have been some alterations that have been made. One of the things that would be most noticeable would be the articulation of the front entry. And in this particular example, we see the pilasters surrounding the front entry and a transom over the doorway. These are characteristics that typically will evolve later. So once again, even though we're trying to find some purity in some of the examples, just keep in mind that these houses, especially the ones in my town, have been lived in for, again, almost 400 years. I will be getting into colors a little later, but as we noticed with the Old Ordinary, the previous slide, a lot of the clapboard siding was just left in its raw state. We'll take another look at an example of American colonial style. This is the John Beale House, also located in Hingham. And this was built in 1699. So we're very late into the 17th century. One of the things that I want to point out, particularly about this dwelling, is again the front entry. In this case, it has been added. We have almost a pseudo portico, enclosed portico that has been added with a pediment roof. And once again, these are characteristics of much later influences. But if we take a look at the upper story, and particularly the second story windows on the front of the house, again, we can see that they're very tightly compacted under the eaves of the roof. The other prominent characteristic, once again, is the central fireplace. And then I brought in one example of a farmhouse. This is the Noah Webster House, which is actually in West Hartford, Connecticut. This particular building dates from the early 18th century. But once again, you can see the very strong colonial characteristics with the central fireplace. Once again, the windows are constructed tight under the eaves. And in this case, the front entry is fairly, again, authentic. One of the other characteristics, and this is something that you can't really go by just to date a house, but a lot of times the number of panes of glass within the windows, whether it's a 12 over 12 or an 8 over 8, also ties into specific periods in time. But once again, remember that these houses are in use for the whole time, and therefore there have been and would be alterations made. I have one more example of architecture, and this is very late. The dates, again, span 1670 to 1820. The one thing to keep in mind is that the colonial style was a very popular style, and it was a very prevalent style. So the time frame seems to be very broad, continuing until 1820. But just realize again that there were new styles being introduced, and again, most of them having ties with Europe. And therefore, it isn't as if just because one style became more popular, then the old style, faded away into oblivion. There is a lot of simultaneously building these new structures still in very old styles. So even though this house, which is the George Lane House from 1756, also in Hingham, what we're looking at as far as the left structure is something that is also incorporating a lot of later characteristics of what would be the Georgian style. Now, as far as furnishings, I have brought in just a few examples again from each stylistic category so that you can see how the American Federal style was really a very refined, very elegant style of interior furnishings. Both of these chairs are, again, considered to be early colonial. And on the program, what I have done is I've split out into two columns. The left column is the architectural style, and the second column is the furniture style. Typically, the styles run very similar in conjunction with one another, but sometimes they're referred to as perhaps different terms or different styles. Also, one of the things that you might notice is that the dates don't always coincide. And I'll talk a little more about this when we do focus on furniture and interior furnishings. But basically, with the early colonial style of furniture, once again, if we went back prior to these two examples that are shown here, we're going to see furniture that was constructed for utilitarian purposes only. So when we're talking again about the settlement of the New World, we're not seeing the importation per se of furniture from England as much as we're seeing people moving to the New World and bringing some of the old traditions with them. So in the early colonial style of furniture, what we typically see is, again, borrowed examples and features that they would have, again, brought from Europe or from Great Britain. We do see a lot of Dutch influence, a lot of English influence, but again, I'm not going to comment too much on the earlier furniture until we get into the American Federal style. Both of these examples are very late. The one on the left is from 1680, and the one on the right is from 1695. Just for comparisons, again, in trying to decipher when one period basically ends and another begins, these examples would be equivalent to the English Elizabethan or Jacobean style that was popular in England in the 17th century. This interior that we can see is from a 1692 farmhouse in Connecticut. And a few of the features that I want to point out, because again, just to make a comparison between the old and the new style, the federal style being the new style, is that we will see, again, the reflection of wealth with the interiors of the American Federal style. If we take a look at this interior view, the first thing that we might notice is a very small room, a large fireplace, but a very small room. And this is quite common, to have low ceilings and, again, smaller rooms that basically function as multi-purpose rooms. We have furniture, which is in the English William and Mary style, which is, again, in our version, or the American version of that, would be early colonial. And what we are seeing, though, a couple of other things to point out, is what we are typically seeing is that the trim work, the woodwork around things like beams or fireplace mantles, window trims, tend to be painted while the walls are typically left in the white plaster. And once again, I'm only pointing out some of these traits so that we can see how the federal style is, again, different. Now we have, again, some transitions to make, again, before a new style fully emerges. But the next architectural stylistic development is what we would call to be the Georgian style. Now if we take a look at this first example, which is another tavern, it's the Cushing Tavern in Hingham that was built in 1746. Now, there are a few things that are starting to emerge. However, the basic form and structure still looks very similar to our advanced stages of American colonial. One of the things to notice here is the fact that we are now dealing with larger spaces, larger structures. Therefore, in this example, we have two fireplaces. And what happens is they start to deviate from the central location within the dwelling and are starting to be pushed out towards the end walls. By the time we do get into the fully developed federal style, we will see the fireplaces and chimneys, of course, located on the flanking end walls. The other thing just to point out here, see the windows tightly compacted under the eaves of the roof. The other thing that we are seeing is, again, the clapboard siding, which is, again, a very prevalent building material for this area. What happens to be new about it, however, other than the fireplaces, is the fact that we're adding embellishment to the corners. And then also the portico that's been added over the entry. Once again, the pediment and the columns, something that is, of course, classically based, but we're going to see this trait escalate throughout the full-fledged Georgian style, and then again become a very prominent feature of the American Federal style. One of the other things that we see developing with the Georgian style is that now we are basically designing with symmetry in mind. We're starting to see the regular placement of the fenestration. We're starting to compose the facades, again, based upon this symmetry that is relative to the front entry, that once again is embellished with some sort of portico, or call a superimposed portico. One of the very strong features is also going to be the use of the columns, whether freestanding or engaged, that run through 2 stories, or again, the full height of the house itself. In this example, which is the John Vassall House, also known as the Longfellow House, this is located in Cambridge, and it dates from 1759. We are noticing again the separation of the chimneys. Once again, by the time we do develop into the federal style, these will be pushed all the way out to the flanking walls. The other interesting component of this style of architecture is that in this case we are still dealing with a fairly steeply pitched roof, but we are introducing the balustrade onto the roof. The triangular pediment in this case has been pushed up into the roof level so that it no longer is just protecting the entryway or placed over the door. And in conjunction with this portico and also the flanking columns, we're getting a bit more emphasis on the vertical. This is one area where the federal style will deviate. Federal style is going to start to emphasize the horizontal. In Georgian, we typically see the lines of the facade emphasizing the vertical. Another example of Georgian style is the Derby House in Salem from 1762. We're noticing once again that the windows have regular placement. We're noticing in this particular example that we are now seeing the chimney stacks pushed to the flanking walls. And once again, from 1762, you can see that we're getting very close to the emerging American Federal style, which typically is 1785 to 1790. This particular structure is made from brick, which once again, it is a building material that was used, but we recognize that its use is most often associated with wealth. The other thing to point out about the Derby House is again the front entry and how we have flanking pilasters and we have the triangular pediment over the transomed doorway. As far as the interior furnishings, again, you've probably noticed that the exterior has become much more refined in its elegance and sense of, again, classical proportions. One of the other things that you've probably noticed is that the clapboard oftentimes is painted. We see a wide range of colors. I have a slide that actually will show some of the colors that are used consistently in American styles. I'll show that to you later. But we are seeing, again, much more refinement in the architectural style. We're starting to see, again, embellishments. We've gone from our main focus of primarily shelter and putting our energies in sustaining ourselves to now towns that are being, again, highly prosperous through either agricultural endeavors or also maritime endeavors. This is the inside of the Derby House, again located in Salem, and this particular room is the parlor. Now, one of the other things that we will see develop will be more specific use rooms. We'll go from a basic two-room or one-room, two-room house, four-room house, to now something where we have particular rooms for particular functions. The parlor is designed, again, as a room, in this case, more of a reception room or a gathering room for guests. But I want to point out again that the fact that these rooms have very low ceilings. If I go back just a moment so you can kind of picture the house itself, because the next four interior slides are from the Derby House. Very impressive on the outside, again, very refined as far as the use of materials, the articulation of moldings, etc. And the inside, for the time period, for this mid-18th century, we would see, again, that this is a home of great wealth. The equivalent in English furniture styles would be the Chippendale style. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. The chairs that are set up around this card table are actually Chippendale chairs. Part of the popularity of this style of furniture was a result of Thomas Chippendale's published director that actually had engraved plates showing different types and styles of furniture. As you probably are aware, Thomas Chippendale was a very influential designer working in London, and when he produced his pattern book, soon and quickly cabinet makers followed with their own pattern books. But how this helped out the American colonies, again, unless you had incredible wealth or considerable wealth, you could not import all of your furniture from England, and therefore the pattern books that made their way into the hands of American craftsmen, they were able to simply, let's say, reproduce some of the popular styles in England. There are a lot of subtleties and differences between American and English styles, so I don't want to come across as saying that the Americans simply copied what was done in England, but there are very subtle nuances that the American craftsmen brought into their own interpretations of these Chippendale styles. One of the other popular styles would also be Queen Anne. And what we're looking at here as far as why this period is classified as Georgian to begin with, obviously, is because of the English monarchs, George, the first George the second, and then eventually moving into George the third. Notice also here we have white walls, white plaster walls. And in this case, the wood trim, the beams in the ceiling, the crown moldings, the wainscoting is all painted using these various earth tones. Typical colors, we would see yellows to some extent, but the yellows would be more of a yellow ochre, the browner yellows. We would see the deep greens, as you see here, and then also some use of a deep blue, which is now we sometimes refer to that as colonial blue. But this is another thing that I want to make a point of in the Georgian style, is that again the American Federal style is going to become much lighter and a little more, not so much pastel, but just very lighter in its color selection and color palettes. The other thing just to point out here is that, once again, this is the home of a wealthy mariner, and the furniture would not be typical for most Americans. If you notice, we have a carpet that is actually a floor covering that's a painted canvas. So although this is a house of considerable wealth, usually one room was selected, perhaps the parlor, perhaps the hall, where again you were going to receive your guests, and therefore those rooms would be more lavishly decorated with furnishings and textiles, because those were the rooms that the public saw, and your whole sense of wealth was what you could show people. So this was another avenue that we're going to see the American Federal style taking over. At this time, we still have limited closets. If we did have some kind of built-in closet, usually they were very, very small, almost like a cupboard. Couldn't really store a lot of things. So the piece of furniture, the corner cupboard, is something that's very popular for this time period. The other thing that we're taking note of is the very large secretary with the cabinets, the overhead cupboards, the drop-down portion that is the writing surface. And then once again, you notice that the chairs are in the Chippendale style. One of the things that I know as someone who writes about furniture in particular is that we tend to fall into the trap of saying that American furniture is Chippendale, but hopefully we can try to label it appropriately. The architectural style is known as Georgian, and typically the furniture style is known as late colonial. So again, how to try to classify it is that if it appears to be similar in appearance and stylistic characteristics to Queen Anne and Chippendale, that particularly American style is late colonial. And the dates for that is basically 1720 to 1785, which again is bringing us right up to that American Federal style. One other room, we house the bedroom. We can see the presence of the high chest, something that Americans very much favored. It is again an English prototype design, but we do see it in some of the wealthier Georgian style homes. And the other thing also is the bed fitted with the valance and the drapes. Once again, we don't see a lot of this room, but you can see from the molding on the ceiling that again we're dealing with moldings very in a limited sense, painted for articulation against the white or even off-white walls. And then this room is actually not from the Derby House, it's from the Dyckman House, and it is dated 1783 So again, just to kind of reinforce the date of 1785, we start to see the American Federal style emerge during that period. However, it's again similar to architectural styles. Just when one new style is introduced, it's not that you throw away all of your things and you start over like we do today. Things weren't as disposable. So taking a look at this interior from 1783, we once again see very low ceilings, very small rooms. The presence of the fireplace pretty much takes over the room as far as its proportion and scale. We do see, again, the furnishings within this space is following along the styles of Thomas Chippendale, and they would be, again, illustrated in the Gentleman and Cabinet Maker's Director that was published in London. This is a house that is actually, again, located in Hingham. It's a couple of houses down from where I live. What's interesting about this house, which is a typical American Federal house, is that it was brought to Hingham on a barge. It was a house that was actually located in Cambridge, and it's the second and third story of a house that was located in Cambridge. This house dates from 1770, and here's a name that you're going to be hearing quite frequently. It was designed by Charles Bulfinch. Okay, I'm sure you know who Charles Bulfinch is, but I'll talk a little more about him in the second half. What we will notice here, and we don't get the whole benefit of this just from the view, but I have several other slides that I'll show you, and it's quite obvious. But what we're doing here is we're taking some of the characteristics that were introduced in the Georgian style, such as the articulation to the corners, the articulation to the entry, in particular, again, a pediment over the doorway. But we are, again, refining it. We're almost simplifying it in a sense. We're cutting back to a bare, formal type of design that is, as you'll see, something that is derivative of the neoclassical movement that was popular in England. One of the things that we would see, again, is the fact that the chimneys will be on the flanking walls, located on the ends. And a couple of things that emerge in more prominence is the use of the fan light. And here we can see over the doorway just what we mean by the fan light. This is something that will, again, take on much more prominence. The other thing that I want to point out is the fact that the windows have trim around the windows. All of the ones so far that we've seen had trim, but once again, keep in mind that in the early colonial, that would have been a little bit of a luxury. So what we will see in the American Federal style is more contrast between the structure and the architectural embellishments. Again, things like porticos, trim around doors and windows, etc. This is a building from 1818. It is the old Derby Academy. It was built as a school. It's also located in Hingham. What we can see with this is, again, in the Federal style, the roofs tend to be less steeply pitched. They're much lower hugging. If we do have a pitch to the roof, some will be flat, as we'll see later. Here we have the fireplaces, again, located on the flanking walls. And in this particular example, we don't see the fan light over the entry, but we do see the second floor, which was the more prominent floor in this structure. The second story windows have the arch over the window, which we typically classify those as Palladian. And this is something that, again, we're going to see a stronger classical influence in our American Federal style. And then one other example, again, of American Federal in residential design. This is actually, again, in Hingham, and it's from the late 18th century. What we are seeing with this example, again, is the articulation of architectural embellishments, again, particularly the corners and the front portico. In this case, it's not superimposed, but it is a true portico. We're seeing more extensive use of classical orders, whether they're Doric or, in this case, the Ionic column. And over the door, we see again the fan light, and now the addition of side lights. This is something that will be a much stronger characteristic of the later federal styles, to have both a transom, usually in the shape of a fan light or again an arch, and then also the side lights. On the second level, we do have a very nice Palladian window, which again is leading us into the realization that it is the American version of the neoclassical movement that was popular primarily in England, but again, we see it throughout Europe. And on the interior, just a little preview of things to come. This happens to be an interior that is dated from 1793 to 1796. And this is the old State House in Connecticut, not the one in Boston, but the one in Connecticut. And again, designed by Charles Bulfinch. What we typically are going to see, or will see on the interior, is again this sense of a lighter color palette. Now what we're doing is we are painting the walls with very soft, sometimes pastel colors, most time pastel colors, and we're taking the trim work, the moldings and the wainscoting, and again any type of interior embellishments, and we're leaving that with the beautiful white woodwork. So we are emphasizing the contrast in a reverse manner from the Georgian style or the early colonial style. One of the things that we're also going to see on the interior in the American Federal style is again the emphasis on neoclassical elements, such as here we're also looking at the columns, in this case our engaged thin columns, are running up the full height of the ceiling. Now keep in mind this is a state house, it's not a residence. Therefore we have the room to bring it up into double volumes. But we will see how this plays out into the residential interior as well. All right, as we are moving along into, again, the late 18th, early 19th century, quickly following the American Federal style, which again, let me just reiterate the date, 1785 to about 1820. And remember, on early colonial, I bridged the time frame through 1820. And again, we do see simultaneously these styles basically again in production or being preferred by a lot of people. It's not just because one style was introduced that everyone ignores the previous style. A little different today. We don't typically go back and want to recreate the 50s ranch style house, but we have our own newer version of that. What we see following is the Greek Revival. The Greek Revival style is something that emerges around 1820, and particularly in residential design 1820. And we do start to see the launching pad basically for the Greek Revival style with the establishment of the designs for Washington, D.C. And we are looking at the influences here brought back from Thomas Jefferson from his term abroad. We're looking at the planning of Washington, D.C. by our French designers. We're looking at the identity for the new United States of America and what identity that should be, but one that resembles the democracy established by the ancient Greeks. So the Greek Revival is something that very much follows the American Federal. It is, however, short-lived to a point, 1860, which is again overlapping the time period that we classify as Victorian. What we do see is that the prominent building material oftentimes is brick. We're much more prosperous. It doesn't matter if it's indigenous or not. We have more accessibility and availability to it. The structures are very monumental, and as we can see here with this structure, the large, massive Doric columns, the portico, we take a look at the triangular portico and we can see a fan light, a holdover from the American Federal. But where the American Federal style emphasized the horizontal, here we are emphasizing the vertical, which is going to give us a sense of monumentality. And obviously, again, this is a derivative from ancient Greek and Roman design. On the interior, this interior is actually from the Monroe House in Charlottesville, Virginia. But it is a good example of showing how the interior furnishings will kind of, again, follow the architectural style of Greek Revival. The style of furniture is known as the American Empire. It is fashioned after the French Empire style, popular in the late 18th, early 19th century, and also has some characteristics of the English Regency style that is also late 18th, early 19th century. A couple of things to point out here is that we tend to go into very deep colors. Again, quite a contrast with the American Empire style versus the American Federal style of interior furnishings. Here we are emphasizing scenic wallpapers. We are emphasizing richer colors, deep golds, deep greens, sometimes emeralds, sapphire blues, crimson reds. And the furniture is very much heavier in its proportions. And again, you'll see this more clearly when we go back to American Federal. But again, the whole influence is not specifically neoclassical in a sense of what we would have seen in England in the 18th century, but now it's very much focused on a very strong Greek influence. So the furniture that we see represented here is, again, bringing about more of a recognition of things that would have been Greek and also early Roman. Now, as we bridge into more Victorianism, a lot of people, when you say Victorian style, they already conjure up a predetermined image of what is the Victorian style. But it really should be classified as a period, a time frame. And what I have listed is approximately 1840 to 1900 as a Victorian style of architecture. And as far as furniture styles, trying to keep it fairly consistent, 1840 to 1900. What we have to realize about the Victorian period is that as a period, it was very much a revivalist period. And I've brought in a few examples of architecture and interiors just to try to convey that. We do have a typical Victorian style that we can classify as truly Victorian, but the fact that people seem to overlook is that there are a sense of eclecticism with a lot of these revival styles. So the first example is from 1848, and it would be representative of the Gothic revival. Now, even within these revivalist styles, there are many interpretations of what Gothic should be. And if we look at the precedent for the Gothic revival in England, it was in 1836 with the reconstruction of Parliament. After the Parliament houses burned, we see a reconstruction in a very Gothic style, which is reminiscent more of the medieval Gothic. If we take a look at this particular house from 1848, which is considered to be Gothic, it doesn't really play out to that sense of medievalism that we typically would see with Gothic architecture. There are certain characteristics that make it more appropriate for Gothic revival, and that would be the vertical emphasis, the very steeply pitched roof, and of course what we tend to label as gingerbreading all over the exterior facade. Another revivalist style that we see is Second Empire. This dates from 1857. It's the Andrew Cushing House. This is also located in Hingham. But if we take a look at this particular dwelling, we are seeing the emphasis of a mansard roof, which is reinterpreted or has been reinterpreted by the architect from what we would see in French Renaissance, the very enormous and massive mansard. And then just one other example, although there are many others, the Italianate style. This is a house that was built in 1868. But if we take a look at just the three, you can see that again, there's a lot of variety, and once again, it's a very eclectic period in time. As far as the furniture and the interiors, you can see where we're heading from the Greek Revival, starting to introduce more of the jewel tones and get away from some of the pastels of the American Federal. Here we see very dark, rich interiors. We see pretty much an emphasis on ornamentation, but again, you can clearly see that we are starting to close in the interiors. That nice, soft, classical refinement and simplification that was prevalent in American Federal has now escaped us. And we could stay here all day. I could have brought in more slides that would take us through to the 20th century. We could talk about Frank Lloyd Wright. We could talk about Charles McIntosh. We could talk about these people who wanted to put that away and get back to purity and simplicity, but we can't. So let's go back. Let's go back to American Federal. Okay, we have to recognize again that even though we claim it as a very American style, that it has had its roots in England. And I wanted to start out by just setting a precedent with a few examples of designs that you probably are familiar with, but we're going to start out with Inigo Jones. This particular structure is called Banqueting House, and it was built in 1619. So if we can think back to some of the American colonial, the early colonial things that I showed you, that date as late as 1680, which was Old Ordinary, and then take a look at this dating from 1619, then it clearly illustrates again that our primary concern was not building beautiful palatial structures. Our emphasis again was on survival. So it is going to take a while before we, in a sense, catch up to some of the more refined styles of England and the rest of Europe. But why I felt that it was appropriate to start with Inigo Jones and his banqueting house is that we really do see a lot of characteristics in this structure that we will see in the American Federal style. One of the things that we're going to notice here is the emphasis on the horizontal. We have a division between stories of these beautiful string courses with dentil molding that is helping to establish this horizontal emphasis. And then if we take a look at the roof line as well, the flat roof, something again that we see on the full-fledged American Federal style, which is articulated by the balustrade going across the top. Other characteristics that we'll see incorporated, here we can see the engaged columns that articulate the facade. And if we take a look at the lower story windows, we're seeing the pediment placed, both triangular and also what we call a segmented pediment over these windows. If we had some close-ups, we would be able to see that there are beautiful festoons that are carved right here along the top story here, and also flanking basically the lintels over the windows. Now, one thing that we do want to recognize, however, is that Inigo Jones didn't come up with this all by himself, as we know, but he had some help. So I'm going to quickly show you a few other examples of some English styles and then go back and we'll see where these came from. What I'm showing you here is Osterley Park, which is actually a renovation project taken on by Robert Adam, and it dates from 1766 to about 1773. He basically came in and put this very classical facade on this structure and then redid the interior, and I'll show you an interior shot in a moment. But if we take a look here, again, what we're going to see is the balustrade across the top, flat roof, and here we have, very elaborate, but here we have the portico. In this case, the ionic columns, the triangular pediment, and all of the detail that we see within the pediment, very classically based. Again, going back to specifically Roman times, who, again, we know is very Greek, very much Greek influenced. On the interior, this is far much more embellishment than what we're going to see in the American Federal style. But once again, we can't ignore the contributions that Robert Adam made to help foster the neoclassical movement in England, which again is our precedent for the American Federal style. The colors tend to be much lighter. This also is true with just the English style. If we were to take a look at the Georgian style In England, the Queen Anne, the Chippendale, we see again dark colors, very rich colors. Here the palette has lightened up significantly. We're seeing a lot of pastels. We're seeing the color take the backdrop for the architectural embellishments. So we're leaving the nice, rich plasterwork and woodwork to the very white or creamy white colorings. As you probably can determine here, very classically based in a sense that we're now dealing with rooms that have niches. This is a favorite of Robert Adam. We're seeing very classical, again, pilasters, urns, the sculptures. And if we take a look at one of his characteristics that he's known for is the embellishment of the ceiling and how the floor pattern emulates what is happening in the ceiling. Now again, we're using this as a basis of comparison. This is very elaborate compared to what our American federal style is going to look like, but once again, we are taking it to a level of a little more simplicity in our interpretation of classicism. This is by the architect George Stewart, also English, and this is Addingham Park from 1783 to 1785. And if we do take a look here, and again, keeping in mind these dates, 1783, 1785, we're right at the dawn of the American federal style in America. But if we take a look at this structure here, it's very much our prototype for the Greek Revival style. So once again, you can see that we tend to follow a lot of the English styles. However, still very much interpretive. Just taking a look again here, we have the base of the structure, very horizontal emphasis, flat roof, the balustrade across the roof, and then how all of this is punctuated right through the center with this vertical emphasis on this portico. And then once again, as I promised, even though we're looking at Inigo Jones from the 17th century, Robert Adam and George Stewart from the 18th century, they are reviving this sense of classicism, which is, again, in England known as the neoclassical movement. They're getting their influence from, here we see Palladio with Villa Rotonda from the 16th century, the emphasis on domed structures, the emphasis on, again, these large porticoed entryways. And again, as we know, Palladio just didn't wake up one morning and decide to build things like this, but he also was inspired by the Romans and the Greeks. And what I've brought in here is a first century example of the Pantheon in Rome, where we do see Roman engineering at its best with the enlarged portico, triangular pediment once again. So how does that bring us into American Federal? We're going to look at a few examples by Charles Bulfinch. Here's where we see Charles Bulfinch starting to be a little more interpretive with, again, some of the characteristics that were being introduced in England through, again, the works of someone like Robert Adam, although there were others. The Joseph Barrel House was actually in Somerville. This is from 1792 to 1793, and we also can see just in that short period of time significant changes. We can see that we are lowering the roof line of the structure. We're taking the balustrade across the whole front over the fenestration in the front elevation. And then what we're seeing here with the portico is the semicircle portico, which is something that we will see in the federal style, but often it's removed from the front and placed on the sides. And then the plans for the new State House, again, Charles Bulfinch. This dates from 1795 to 1798. We're seeing, again, the incorporation of things like the dome, which was popularized, again, first by the Romans, but again, typical with Italian Renaissance design, and typical also with our English neoclassical style. We are seeing the use of these Palladian windows, again, as you can see on the sides. The articulation of the entryway, which has been projected, so we're seeing basically a variation of planes on the facade. And then, again, taking a look across here, lower pitched roof and the horizontal emphasis brought in with the balustrade. Here we have the actual built structure. And then an example of the interior. So once again, even though this is not a residence, but it is a government building, we are seeing the lighter color palette. We're seeing the use of color on the walls, and now the contrast between that coloring and the creamy white of the woodwork or plasterwork. We're starting to see, again, how some of Robert Adams' neoclassical swags are being incorporated into our American Federal style. We're seeing the emphasis again on these fan lights, the niches, all right, as you can see over here. And then again, it's a little difficult to see some of the furnishings, but I am going to spend a little bit of time on the furniture. Here we have the Pingree House, built 1804. This is in Salem, Massachusetts, and it's by another very proud New Englander, Samuel McIntyre, a master woodcarver. We have examples of architecture, but more specifically, an example of interior embellishments and furnishings executed by Samuel McIntyre. Again, this is 1804, so we're starting to see again this kind of solidified American Federal style. We see the emphasis is on the horizontal. We're seeing the, again, the Palladian window that in this case is right above the entry on the second level. There is a slight pitch to the roof, but it is almost negligible. And then once again, the side flanking chimneys. This is the interior. We are taking a look again and noticing once again the white details, or the details left in the white creamy plasterwork or woodwork, and then once again the soft pastel colors used on the wall surfaces themselves. Some of the things that we would see introduced would be scenic papers, but they tend to have a little later date attached to them, more 1810, 1820, and well into the 1830s, where the scenic wallpapers are a little more prevalent. And then here we have another example, again, of American Federal, but as you can see, we're missing the Palladian window here and the fan light, but we do still see the flanking fireplaces, the balustrade, and the articulation of some kind with either, again, a portico or a superimposed portico at the entry. And then the interior. This is actually the Harrison Gray Otis house, which I'm not sure if hopefully you would have time to go and visit it. But on the interior, again, we're starting to see very restrained classicism, and then again the white molding and how nice it stands out against the contrasting background. And then here we have a fan light, again over this entry, and the side lights, which is actually carved by Samuel McIntyre. One of the things I wanted to point out here is the shape of the tracery on the side lights, because what I want to show you next is the furniture that again fits into conjunction with these interiors. Now I had to bring this in because it's very prominent, and it's something that's very well known, the White House. What we're seeing here is a structure, the main structure in the American Federal style, that has been modified. It was first built in 1762. James Hoban, which was a architect from South Carolina, who won the competition to build and design and build the White House. But the porticos and the Greek Revival influence that we see was added by Benjamin Latrobe. And again, the one thing that I want to point out is if we look at the main structure itself, especially the articulation of the pediments over the windows, and again the balustrade across the roof, it very much resembles Banqueting House by Inigo Jones. Okay, I want to briefly go through some of the furniture. I'm not going to point out a lot of the fine details and characteristics because I think the slides speak for themselves. But just again to refresh our precedent and to put these interior furnishings into its proper placement, I brought this in as our quintessential American Federal style home. This one actually dates from about 1811. Here we have again our side lights around the entry, the fan light above the door, our portico, the Palladian window in the second level. And this house is very modest by comparison to some of the Bullfinch houses. But again, I thought that it would be the best example to set this up for here we can see some of the colors that are popular in the American Federal style. But to set it up for our typical 18th century family. And again, just to keep in mind that the house that I just showed you would be modest, but still owned by someone who had some sense of wealth, not considerable wealth, but made a very good living, probably again of the merchant class. And what I do like to do is to bring in some of the artwork just so that we can see what these people were like. And I think costuming helps tremendously to really put us into a time period. But again, very quickly, I'm just going to show you some of the interiors of these federal-style homes, and then again, specifically some of the furnishings. But here we're seeing a very modest interior, the bedroom, with a few pieces. This particular four-poster bed is something that we characterize as the American Federal style. The furniture designs are based after English designs by George Hepplewhite and Thomas Sheraton. Following the success of Thomas Chippendale's drawing book, these two gentlemen published drawing books that again contained engraved plates of fashionable furniture for the English gentleman. And so once again, what we're seeing is at this time period not a lot of importation of English furniture, primarily because Thomas Jefferson put an embargo against importing furniture in 1807. Therefore, we see the rise of the American craftsman, and some of the best and finest examples of American furniture are coming from the Federal period. And again, a lot of this is because of the embargo imposed by Thomas Jefferson. Just one other note about that is that he did this after he crated in 26 crates of furniture from France for Monticello, but we all know what politicians can do, so we won't be too hard on him. But it did entice American craftsmen to rival a lot of the English craftsmen. Here we have a front entryway. This mirror, we tend to call it a fisheye mirror, but this tends to be, again, something that is very closely aligned with the American Federal style. Some of the furniture that is also in this room, this piece in particular, is a little later, which again, remember, would be American Empire. It follows right after American Federal. But once again, I love to bring in the beds because they're very elegant, very refined, and to some extent the beds were some of the most expensive pieces within the home, in addition to something like a large bookcase, secretary bookcase. Here we have a small bookcase that's tucked away in the corner. And again, the styles would follow very closely with what would be illustrated in both, again, Hepplewhite's drawing book or Sheraton's. In England, we tend to call this a Hepplewhite style. Hepplewhite style furniture usually emphasizes curved backs, this one being a shield. And on the program, you actually have a couple of other examples. Again, this one being the shield, this one being an oval. And on the program, you see the heart-shaped, which, again, we have to look at the furniture in conjunction with the architecture. It all evolved at the same time. We often have architects who are specifying designs for the furniture for these dwellings. So we do see the direct correlation between the two. And more specifically, if you take a look at this beautiful little chair, and you can see the nail heads are in these beautiful little festoons. The Sheraton style tends to be more angular, and what we do see is more of the squared off backs, typically, again, identified in England as the Sheraton style. A lot of people kind of address that with a little bit of controversy because in Hepplewhite's drawing book, you will see some styles that typically people refer to as Sheraton style and vice versa. Just another thing to keep in mind is that these two people worked very closely in the same time period, and they were merely documenting the popular styles for their country. This is something, though, that we typically call an American chair. It's called the Martha Washington, and it is also referred to as a lolling chair because it doesn't serve pretty much any purpose. It's not a dining room chair, it's not a boudoir chair, but it's a chair to simply sit in and do nothing. So that's why they call it a lolling chair. And again, considering the Puritan background, idle hands were not too favorable. So it's a very comfortable chair, but again, one that they deemed as a lolling chair because you simply just do nothing when you're in it. Now, sofas and settees, again, are pieces that they've been around for a while. We see them actually date back to even Roman times, but we will see with the introduction of Thomas Chippendale much more comfortable sofas, some that are upholstered, and again, a little, to me this still looks very formal and very uncomfortable, but by their standards it would have been very comfortable. But anyway, settees and sofas were definitely something that was a luxury of only the rich. This one, as we can see, a small settee, pretty much just large enough for two. And then one of the things that we do see in architecture of the American Federal period is that the dining room starts to take on prominence. Prior to the dining room, you usually had a folding table that was set up in one of the bedrooms or in one of the main rooms downstairs. And if we think of colonial times, again, they might only have one room or two rooms or perhaps four downstairs. So as the dining room became more prominent, we start to see smaller tables. This one's called a Pembroke. It's fitted with a drawer and it has two drop leads. These were like little occasional tables that could be used as tea tables, and they were easily moved about. The dining room, because again it became a very popular room in the American Federal style, you used it for entertaining, and possibly the family would take evening meals in the room, but it again is one of the rooms that was your show place. So it wasn't something that was used frequently, daily, just because of the wear and tear. The other thing that we do see is casters become very common on our American Federal furniture, and this again leads us to realize the fact that these tables were very portable, that we could move them from room to room. This actually, of course, is a gaming table. We have new furniture that's introduced in this time period, not specifically just American Federal, but also English neoclassic. Because the dining room is now a very prestigious room, we have to come up with a piece of furniture suitable for the dining room, and that is the sideboard. So this is something that, again, is very characteristic of American Federal. Ours, again, American, is much smaller than what you would see in England, and primarily, again, it's because our rooms are much smaller than what we would see in England. The lines of furniture, again, tend to be very straight, almost angular in a lot of these case pieces, very straight, tapering legs, another very strong characteristic. And this actually is a sideboard, very small, fitted with drawers. Again, the sideboard would be used in the dining room, the new dining room. And what we typically will see with American Federal style furniture is not a strong emphasis on carving as much as there's an emphasis on inlay. So some of the pieces, this is another sideboard, but some of the pieces are featuring these beautiful inlay patterns, and I have a close-up of that here so that you can see. And again, you can probably determine that these are taken from the fanlight inspiration from the exterior architecture. Our secretaries and bookcases, still a very important piece of furniture for the home. This is our link to communication. Everyone would write letters daily, so desks would be a very prominent and necessary piece of furniture. Here, I just wanted to point out again what we would see as far as incorporating the furniture with the architecture is these very delicate swags or festoons. And again, all of this is inlay. Once again, the English equivalent would be Hepplewhite and Sheraton style, but we would call them American Federal. And then I brought in this desk. It's a writing desk, a very small one. But what I felt was interesting is to show you some of the inlay, specifically here of the eagle. Just keep in mind the time period, 1785, obviously we're following the end of the American Revolution, and therefore the sense of Americanism or this patriotism was quite strong. So on a lot of furniture, we will see the incorporation of the bald eagle motif. Here is another bookcase, but again, just to point out to you here, some of this work on the front panels and how hopefully it will remind you of some of the details of the side lights that we would see in the American Federal home. I think it is again important to look at furniture in conjunction with the architecture because one could not exist without the other. Everything that you see in furniture evolves because of the architectural setting. Here we have a chest on a chest, very massive piece, but again, just to point out some of the classical features through here, and again, the fact that we're dealing with this triangular pediment, the positioning of the urn finials at the top, once again, the influence of Robert Adam and some of his architectural influences on, again, the American Federal style. Now, as we get nearer to 1810, 1820, there is an American designer who I'm sure we're all familiar with, Duncan Phyfe. One of the things also I'd like to leave you with today is that there isn't such a thing as the Duncan Phyfe style. And when I go to antique places all over the country and somebody is trying to sell me a piece of furniture and they say it's Duncan Phyfe, you know, I just want to take them and say, wait a minute. First of all, there's very limited original furniture that is attributed to Duncan Phyfe, and second, it's not a style of furniture. Duncan Phyfe, as you probably are aware, was a very prominent cabinet maker working in Albany and New York, and his claim to fame is really, you know, not just that he was a great cabinet maker, but he had some of the wealthiest clients in New York City. What we typically will do with this type of furniture is we can identify it that it's a little different from the normal American Federal style, and that's simply because it's starting to take on characteristics of the American Empire style. One of the things that we might note about these chairs, which have been attributed to Duncan Phyfe along with the table, is that they do start to take on more Greek influences. So once again, he started his prime, the prime of his career, starts in the American Federal period and extends into the American Empire, which pretty much ends around 1830. I'll show you a few more Duncan Phyfe pieces. This is something that, again, we typically would identify as coming from the workshop of Duncan Phyfe, or again, completed by a contemporary of Duncan Phyfe. It still has very strong Sheraton style influences. Sheraton, again, the English furniture designer. But what we're seeing is with the curvature of the crest rail, this top rail here, and what we can't see with the rolling of the back and the rolling of the legs, is that it very much is, again, following more of a Greek influence. Here is a pedestal table. This one has been attributed to Duncan Phyfe. And we see again the prominence of the urn shape right here. And in this card table, also Duncan Phyfe. Again, how prominent this eagle is in our American Federal style. And then just to also introduce one other American craftsman, he was actually trained in France, came to the United States and had a very lavish, productive career as a cabinet maker, Charles-Henri Lanour, who has done, again, or most of his clients were the very affluent of New York City. What we can see even with his designs is that they're starting to very much go back to a Greek and Roman influence. And if we try to, again, tie this into the architecture, it is right on the cusp between American Federal and the emerging American Empire style. And I just wanted to end it with this piece, which is clearly American Empire. We're starting to see, again, more of